Hello everyone. How's it going? This is Azren, the language nerd here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to today's podcast episode and, of course, YouTube video. This is the first episode here that's coming to you from Taipei. I recorded a whole bunch from Calgary, where I live, and currently I am in Taipei doing some Mandarin study. I'm taking some classes, I'm doing language exchanges, I'm living with a homestay family. For those of you that have followed my YouTube particularly, and my social media platforms, where you can see videos and pictures that I post, this background right now actually might look quite familiar because I've stayed in this with this homestay family before. I'm here for most of the summer. It's actually the hottest time to be in Taipei. The average temperature every day is about 40 degrees or higher with the humidity. So for those of you that are in the US, that's about, I want to say that's about, it's over 100 degrees. It's got to be over 100 degrees for sure. So it's very, very hot. Today, I'm continuing my series on Azren's top language learning tips. However, before we do that, I'd like to answer a question from a current Calgary Language Nerds student. This is from Nick. Nick is taking Blackfoot lessons. Blackfoot is an Indigenous language spoken in southern Alberta in Canada, as well as northern Montana. And basically he's asking if I know much about the literature on language learning and its relationship to dreams. His question specifically is, what level does a person need to have in order to start dreaming in their target language? Now, all I would like to do today is share a personal anecdote to answer this question, because I actually don't know what the literature is around this topic. But I can share an interesting personal story. Approximately, I want to say 7 years ago, something like that. It was roughly 2016, 2015, something like that. I had a dream where I was in China. Now, my dreams in the past have gotten pretty unique, to say the least, because this dream that I had where I was in China was a dream that lasted a year. Meaning I slept one night, but in my dream, I would go to sleep and wake up. And I lived a whole year in China in my dream. I was very disoriented when I woke up in real life, as you can imagine. So I was in China. Now, it's important to understand that I didn't speak Mandarin very well at this time. If memory serves correctly, I just started learning and I had a beginner level in the language. And yet, I was in my dreams, I was hearing Mandarin, I was talking to people, I had friends, I had teachers, I would go shopping in this supermarket where I'd buy things. And I was living a day-to-day life that was in Mandarin despite having a beginner level. So I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think in general there's necessarily I don't think it necessarily means, oh, I'm dreaming in the language, so that means I'm very fluent. I don't necessarily think that's always the case. Some people I have heard say that when they started to dream in the language they're learning, that truly was an indication for them that that they spoke the language fluently, and maybe there's something there. The honest answer is I don't know, but that question did make me think of that dream I had many years ago, and I wanted to share it with you. Now, let's move on to Azren's top language learning tips topic for today, which is an episode about learning grammar. People often wonder, how do you go about learning new grammar points? I'd like to share a process that I've come up with that works quite well for most grammar points. Here's the process. Step one is you need to get exposed to a new grammar point. My personal preference is to be exposed to a grammar point organically, meaning I hear a native speaker saying a certain type of sentence, and it makes me wonder what that type of sentence means. Meaning I hear a native speaker speaking, they use a specific grammar point that I'm unfamiliar with, and that becomes my initial exposure. However, often I have been exposed to grammar points in a classroom setting from a teacher or from another person. That's not as organic. It's more someone teaching the language who teaches me, okay, there is this grammar point that exists. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that at all. You can definitely be exposed to it that way too. So you need some kind of exposure to a new grammar point, one way or another. Step two is learn the theory behind the grammar point. So how does a grammar point work? If it's Spanish, for example, you might learn the present tense and you can learn the conjugation rules, for instance. Step three Actually, going back to step 2, in step 2, it'll be very helpful to get lots of example sentences that demonstrate the grammar point. Examples are your friend when it comes to learning grammar points. If you're struggling to wrap your head around how a grammar point works and you're not understanding, don't, for the most part, seeking out further explanations it may not be the best path to follow. Often that doesn't work. What does work very often is more examples that demonstrate the grammar point. So again, if you're struggling to grasp how a grammar point works, and you've already tried to go down the route of having people explain the grammar point to you, and it's not really sticking, well, what you might want to do instead is seek out more example sentences. This can be done by asking a native speaker or a teacher, for example, to give you lots of example sentences. This could be by going on Google, on the internet, really, lots of different places, and seeking out example sentences. You could use a tool such as ChatGPT, which I talked about in a previous episode in the series, to get some example sentences. There's lots of ways to do it, but that might help you understand demonstrate how that grammar point works much better than the actual explanation of the grammar point itself. Step 3, you'll want to do some practice questions. Maybe think of worksheets, essentially. Worksheets that are designed to help you practice the grammar point. Step 4, you actually create your own sentences using the grammar point. You sit down and think, okay, what can I say? What could I write or say? You probably write them down. You can write them down and say, what can I write that incorporates this grammar point? Maybe 20, 30, 4, X number of sentences. Quite a few. More the better, really. Step 5, in step 4, make sure you get them corrected. Make sure you did it correctly. You want to make sure someone tells you if those sentences are right or wrong. Step 5, keep paying attention to how native speakers use that grammar point in natural speech. And step 6, make a special effort to use that grammar point when you're conversing or texting with people or writing in general. That's a good little 6-step process you can use. Now, for simpler grammar points, you might be able to stop at step 4. You expose yourself to the new grammar point, you learn the theory, you do some quizzes and worksheets, you create your own sentences. That might be enough for relatively simple grammar points, and that might help you internalize it well enough. It's the more complex ones that you might go to step 5 and step 6. Okay. Now, there are other ways to learn grammar points. This isn't the only way to learn. Some people prefer to absorb grammar naturally by consuming lots of comprehensible input. Comprehensible input, if you remember from previously in the series, comprehensible input is listening or reading material that essentially is at your level. That's the simplest way to view it. And also that you find at least somewhat interesting. Okay. So that is one way to do it. You might be able to naturally absorb grammar that way too. For some people that works really well. So if that works for you, by all means, you're more than welcome to go down that route. Another way you can look at learning grammar points, it's almost the opposite. It's almost the opposite of what I just shared here, that 6-step process. What you can do instead for particularly complicated grammar points is, instead of trying to learn the grammar point as a whole, you learn phrases that incorporate the grammar point. So you don't try to learn the grammar point and learn all the rules and the exceptions and memorize them all. You just focus on learning individual phrases that incorporate the grammar point. I've done that for a number of different things. I mean, often that's my starting point for very complicated grammar points. I did it for the French subjunctive, to an extent the Spanish subjunctive, but not to the same extent as in French. Ba structures in Mandarin, same with bei to an extent in Mandarin, although not nearly to the same extent now that I'm thinking of it. In Gujarati, there were some complicated grammar points with the past tense that really threw me off. And I would just memorize certain phrases initially that I said a lot in my day-to-day speech. It's important to realize that the way I learn languages, I put myself in situations where I'm around native speakers quite frequently. So that is something worth mentioning, I suppose. So I do use it quite a bit, use my languages quite a bit. It's worth mentioning that, I suppose. But that is one way you can do it, where you start by learning some phrases that incorporate the grammar point, and you just internalize those phrases and memorize them. And over time, you start to figure out the grammar point as a whole so you can use it in a wider variety of circumstances. In fact, what might even happen is if you were to slowly but surely memorize a certain number of phrases, your brain might start to figure out, I'm starting to see how this grammar point works. And that goes back to something I was saying earlier today. Examples are often what fill in the gaps in your brain to explain how a grammar point works. Sometimes it's not the explanation, depending on the person, but for many people, it's not the explanation that'll do it, it's the examples that'll do it. You get enough examples of the grammar point being put into practice, and your brain goes, I'm starting to see it. So if you start to memorize certain phrases that incorporate the grammar point, and you've memorized over months, 29 phrases or something like that, right? And you've internalized them, your brain, for many of you, your brain will start to go, I think I understand how this works now. The last two things I'll say on grammar, learning grammar here is, first of all, understand that different grammar points seem to take different amounts of time to learn. Sometimes a grammar point will just make sense really quickly. And sometimes it might take a year before it finally makes sense, or a year and a half of constant practice, study, etc., before finally it makes sense. It doesn't mean you study the one grammar point for a year, because that's pretty crazy. It might mean that you learn it to an extent, doesn't fully make sense, you move on and you come back to it later. Like when you eat food, your food needs to digest in your body. Well, grammar points digest too, and they all have different digestion times. So some of them will take a long time to digest. So you eat a little bit, your body goes, ooh, I'm full. Or your brain goes, oh, I'm full. Digests over 6 months, you come back to it. You're able to take a little bit more, it digests. 6 months later, you come back, you take a little more, and then within 2 years, you've learned that one grammar point. Don't get discouraged by that, by the way. It's not necessarily bad if something takes you 2 years to learn. That's actually perfectly fine. And that does lead me to my second point here, which is you don't necessarily have to be a master of every single grammar point that exists in another language. It depends quite a bit on the goals that you have for the language that you're learning. That's what it depends primarily on. If you want to simply become conversational, well, you don't need to focus all that much on grammar, not all that much, because to become conversational, you're allowed to make little mistakes when you're speaking. And there are lots of grammar points you never even have to study, because it doesn't affect your comprehension and doesn't affect your ability to actually converse or communicate in the language you're trying to learn. So many of you, probably even the majority of you, probably don't need to over-obsess over grammar, really. It can be a relatively small part of your language learning journey, relatively small. Now, if you do want to speak the language at a near native level of proficiency or very, very advanced level of proficiency, that's a bit of a different story. And that's where it might take you, for certain grammar points, a 6, 12, 18-month window for your brain to finally grasp how it works. At least that's been my personal experience. And as I talk to different language learners, it seems to be their experience too. And that's been something I've noticed really over the past 15 years that I've noticed that. So I hope you guys liked today's podcast episode and, of course, YouTube video. Have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to contact me by visiting Azren, thelanguagenerd.com/contact. That's AZ or ZREN, thelanguagenerd.com/contact. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. It's nighttime here in Taipei. And we'll chat later. Bye-bye. See you.